Have you ever sat at a funeral where the grief in the room wasn't yours to claim, yet somehow, it was the only weight your heart could carry? Where you weren't listed in the program, weren't expected to speak, weren't even noticed, but still, you showed up, because a promise had kept you breathing all these years. The church smelled faintly of old wood and wilted flowers. Rain tapped gently on the roof, like the world itself was remembering something it hadn't spoken of in a long time. Inside, people gathered in soft whispers, family, neighbors, a pastor straightening his notes. All of them looking ahead. None of them looking back. But in the last pew, there sat a man, alone. His coat was worn at the elbows. The kind of wear that didn't come from age, but from years of holding on to something that no longer held back. He sat with a stillness that didn't ask for attention, but carried a gravity that bent the silence around him. He hadn't cried. Not yet. But his eyes were fixed on the casket like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. And in his hand, clenched tight against his chest, was a small wooden box, the size of a folded flag. No one noticed him walk in. No one saved him a seat. And still, he had come. Because long before this day, long before this casket and the lilies and the kind words spoken by strangers, he had buried something deeper. A bond. A battlefield. A vow. And when no one else remembered, he still did. And that was why he was here. Walter Dean didn't come for the words. He didn't need the hymns, or the eulogy, or the carefully chosen phrases meant to make grief easier to swallow. He came because of something older than grief. Something made not in a chapel, but in a rainstorm 50 years ago, when two men stood under a fractured sky and gave their word. They never said it out loud, not the way civilians might think. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't dramatic. It was a simple exchange, carved out of fear and brotherhood. "If I don't make it," Sam had muttered through clenched teeth, "you bring it back." Walter had looked at the blood on Sam's uniform and said, "You're gonna make it." "I'm not." "You know I'm not." Walter hadn't answered. He just reached over and took the flag from Sam's chest pocket, folded, dirted, still warm from being carried close to the heart. And now, after all these years, after wars and winters and the slow, quiet disappearance of so many things, the flag was still with him. Still folded. Still waiting. Walter looked down at the box in his hands as the pastor's voice echoed in the chapel, naming Sam's accomplishments, his years as a mechanic, a father, a neighbor. Good things, honest things. But nothing about who he'd been before the years had softened him. Nothing about the fire in his lungs as he shouted warnings. Nothing about the last time he bled. No one else knew that Sam had once saved 12 lives by standing his ground when the rest ran. No one knew what he carried home in silence. No one remembered. Except Walter. And now, that promise, quiet, battered, soaked in rain, was heavier than ever. Walter sat still for as long as he could. The pastor's voice filled the chapel with polite memories. Stories from a life well lived. Fixing cars. Raising 2 daughters. Coaching Little League. All good things. But none of them reached the weight Walter felt pressing against his ribs. He looked down again at the box in his lap. His fingers tightened around it without thinking. The old hinges had rusted slightly. The varnish had dulled. But the contents were still perfect. Still sacred. His breath slowed. His chest rose, fell, rose again, this time with more weight. He didn't want to stand up. He didn't want eyes on him. He didn't want the quiet to stretch into something awkward. But he knew the moment was coming. It had been building since the moment he stepped into the church. Since the moment he saw Sam's name printed on the small bulletin by the door. Since the moment the casket was wheeled into place. He shifted his feet. One foot planted, then the other. And slowly, Walter Dean stood. Heads turned. Some just glanced. Others stared outright. A few leaned in to whisper, "Who is he? Was he a friend of Sam's? Why is he standing?" Walter didn't speak. He couldn't. The words would have cracked before they left his throat. He stepped into the aisle. Each step forward was quiet. Steady. But it carried weight, like the wooden floorboards beneath him had to remember something they'd long forgotten. The pastor paused mid-sentence, unsure whether to continue. Walter kept walking. He passed pew after pew. People turned in their seats. Some nodded politely. Most just looked confused. He didn't meet their eyes. He kept his focus ahead, on the flagless casket at the altar. When he reached the front, he stopped. Just a few feet from where Sam lay. He opened the box. Inside, folded with care and age, was the flag. The one that had never been given. The one that had waited 5 decades to return home. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he lifted it out. Not from age, but from the unbearable weight of memory. He placed the flag gently, right at the foot of the casket. Not on top, that wasn't his right. But close enough for Sam to feel it. Then, for the first time since entering the church, Walter spoke. Soft. Barely above a whisper. But clear. Welcome home, brother. And then he stepped back. Not one person in that room spoke. Even the air seemed to still. The pastor slowly lowered his notes. A woman in the second pew dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A younger man bowed his head. And Walter, he didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just returned to the back pew, folded his hands again, and sat down. It was done. But nothing felt the same. For a few long moments, the chapel didn't move. The air held its breath, like it, too, was unsure what had just happened. Walter Dean sat back down in the last pew. His hands rested gently in his lap, but his shoulders hadn't fully relaxed. He didn't look around. He didn't seek approval or explanation. He had done what he came to do. At the front of the chapel, the flag sat silently at the foot of Sam's casket. No one dared touch it. The neatly folded triangle seemed to glow faintly in the soft light from the stained glass window above. It didn't need to be announced. Its presence said everything that hadn't been said. The pastor cleared his throat, tried to find his place in the service, but the moment had already shifted. His prepared words felt smaller now, almost like background noise. Even he seemed to recognize that something deeper had just taken root. Near the front, a woman stood. Early 60s, carefully dressed, clutching a worn purse in both hands. Her name was Margaret Lane, Sam's oldest daughter. She hadn't spoken during the service, hadn't made eye contact with anyone outside her immediate family. But now, she took a slow step toward the flag. She looked at it, then turned to face the congregation. I didn't know, she said quietly. I didn't know my father served. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone murmured, "What?" under their breath. Margaret continued, her voice trembling but steady. He never talked about it. Not once. He told us about car engines, baseball games, the weather. But never about war. Never about this. She looked down at the flag again, then turned her gaze toward the back pew, toward Walter. You knew him before we did, didn't you? Walter didn't move at first. Then he nodded, once. Margaret's voice caught. Did he suffer? Walter shook his head slowly. He carried it. Quietly. That was all he said. That was all he needed to say. Margaret knelt down and picked up the flag. Her hands trembled as she held it close to her chest, like she was trying to learn who her father was by the weight of what he left behind. One of the grandsons, maybe 20, stood beside her. He looked confused, even hurt. He whispered, "Why didn't he tell us?" Margaret answered, not turning. Some things are too heavy to share. Even with family. Silence returned again. Not uncomfortable. Just full. Like the room itself was letting something settle. Walter stood once more, not to speak, not to intrude, but to give one last nod toward the man he'd kept a promise to. And then, without a word, he turned and began walking toward the door. No one stopped him. No one needed to. Because in that single act, in the quiet return of a folded flag, Walter had said everything. About loyalty. About memory. About the kind of love that outlives even recognition. As the door closed behind him, Margaret stood holding the flag, tears streaming down her face. She whispered, almost to herself, "Thank you, Dad. For all of it." And the service continued, but no one would forget the moment it changed. After the final hymn faded and the last prayer was spoken, the congregation slowly began to disperse. Some paused at the front to place a hand on the casket, others offered soft words to Margaret and her family. But for many, it was just another service. Another quiet goodbye. Margaret didn't leave. She stayed where she was, seated in the front pew, holding the flag close to her chest like something fragile. Her fingers brushed along the edges of the fabric, tracing the folds as if they might somehow tell her more than her father ever had. Her younger sister, Karen, leaned in and whispered, "Are you okay?" Margaret nodded faintly. I thought I knew him. All these years. And then today, I find out there was a whole part of his life he never shared." Karen didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Maybe he was protecting you. Maybe he didn't want to bring the war into this house." Margaret sighed. "I know. But it still feels like something's missing." She stood up and walked toward the back of the chapel. Walter was gone. The pew where he had sat now sat empty, but on the seat, left neatly in place, was a small envelope. Margaret hesitated, then picked it up. Her name was written on the front, in handwriting that wasn't familiar. She opened it slowly. Inside was a short note, written in plain, careful words. "Margaret. He never wanted you to carry what he carried. But he asked me, once, to tell you if I ever had the chance. Your father was brave. He saved lives. He stood his ground when it mattered. But more than that, he loved you. He loved your family. That's why he kept it quiet. Don't let the silence make you think he was hiding. He was holding it, for you. W.D." Her hand shook as she read it again. Karen walked up beside her, peeking over her shoulder. "Who's W.D.?" Margaret folded the letter slowly. "Walter Dean. The man with the flag." Karen looked around. "Where'd he go?" "I don't know." They both stood there in the quiet. Margaret turned back toward the casket. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "I wish he would have told me." A woman standing nearby overheard and said gently, "Sometimes love sounds like silence. Especially from men who've seen too much." Margaret didn't answer. She just nodded, eyes full. Outside, the rain had started again, light, steady, like a memory returning. And though Walter Dean had left without a word, what he brought into that chapel would stay long after the flowers had wilted, after the casket was lowered, after the world moved on. Because what he returned that morning wasn't just a flag. It was the truth. The chapel didn't empty the way most do after a funeral. People lingered. They didn't talk much, but they stayed, some standing quietly near the walls, others seated with their hands folded in their laps. It was as if no one quite knew how to leave. Margaret Lane remained at the front, flag still in hand, the note from Walter tucked carefully inside her coat. Her sister Karen stood beside her, eyes distant, caught somewhere between confusion and understanding. Across the aisle, an older man in a dark suit approached. He looked familiar to Margaret, though she couldn't place him. He removed his hat before speaking. "I served with your father. Not directly, but we were in the same region. Korea, early 50s. Margaret looked up. He never mentioned Korea. Not once. The man nodded. Most didn't. Those memories had a way of settling into silence. But when I saw the flag, and that man, I remembered. He paused, then added, "I didn't know your father personally. But I knew what kind of men those were. Quiet. Steady. The kind who carried more than they let on." Margaret gave him a faint smile. "That sounds like him." From the back of the chapel, a younger man stepped forward, early 30s, dressed plainly, probably someone who knew Sam from work or the neighborhood. He cleared his throat. "I didn't know Mr. Price served either. He fixed my truck a dozen times. Charged less than anyone else. Always said, 'Don't worry about the bill, just drive safe.'" He paused. "I never knew there was a soldier under all that grease." More murmurs followed. A woman from the community choir stepped forward. A teenager who had helped with lawn care. One by one, people began to speak, not about battles, but about quiet kindnesses, steady presence, the kind of man who showed up when you needed him and never asked for anything in return. Karen leaned in. "I always thought Dad was just ordinary." Margaret shook her head. "He was. And that's the part one never understood. How much strength it takes to stay ordinary after everything he must have seen." She looked down at the flag again. The pastor returned to the front, this time without notes. He looked over the gathered faces, now no longer just attendees, but witnesses. "I think we've all learned something today," he said softly. "Sometimes funerals remind us of what we've lost. But every now and then, they remind us of who someone truly was." He let the silence hang. And that kind of truth doesn't come from speeches. It comes from moments like this. When something hidden comes into the light, and we choose to carry it forward. Margaret felt her chest tighten, not from grief, but from a strange kind of clarity. A truth settling into place. Her father hadn't needed to speak about what he did. His life had already told the story, just in a language she hadn't known how to hear. Now, she did. And for the first time that day, she felt ready to say goodbye. The chapel was nearly empty now. Just a few remained, quietly gathering coats, murmuring final words, offering soft nods instead of farewells. But Margaret stayed seated near the front, flag still in her hands, her shoulders squared but heavy, as if the folded triangle she held weighed far more than cloth and thread. She looked down at it, studying the careful creases. The stars were perfectly aligned. The stitching still tight. It hadn't unraveled, not after all these years. She wondered how many times Walter had taken it out, folded it again, then tucked it back away. Not out of duty, but out of something deeper. Something harder. Karen returned from speaking with a neighbor and sat beside her. She glanced at the flag, then at her sister. "You okay?" she asked. Margaret didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, she said, "I've been holding this for almost an hour, and I still can't believe how heavy it feels." Karen nodded, thinking it was just about grief. But Margaret continued, her voice low, steady. "Not just heavy like sadness. Heavy like, a truth I wasn't prepared to carry." Karen looked at her with concern. "You don't have to figure it all out today." "I'm not trying to figure it out," Margaret said. "I'm trying to understand why he never gave this to us himself. Why he trusted a stranger to do it." Karen paused, choosing her words carefully. Maybe he didn't think he had the right words. Maybe it was easier to just keep going, fixing cars, mowing lawns, being a good neighbor. Margaret gave a small, sad smile. "He was all those things. But now I know he was something else, too. And I never saw it." Karen placed a hand gently on her sister's back. "I think he was protecting us," she said. "From what it meant to carry this. From what it would change in how we saw him." Margaret looked again at the flag. She held it closer now, not like a burden, but like something earned. "I thought I'd feel proud," she whispered. "But all I feel is, small. Like I missed something important for years and didn't even know to look." Karen leaned her head gently against Margaret's shoulder. "He didn't need you to look," she said. "He just needed you to live your life. That was the gift." Margaret didn't speak again. She just sat in the quiet, the weight of the flag resting against her heart. Outside the windows, the light had shifted. The rain had stopped. The wind had calmed. But inside, what remained was still heavy. Still quiet. And for the first time, Margaret began to understand what it meant to carry someone else's silence. Not as shame, or regret, or guilt, but as love. Folded tight. Held close. Never spoken, yet always present. Walter Dean didn't wait for thanks. He didn't linger by the doors or look over his shoulder for someone to call his name. When the last words of the service were spoken and the room began to thin, he simply stood, adjusted his coat, and walked down the aisle one last time. His footsteps were soft, but somehow, everyone still noticed. Margaret turned just in time to catch a glimpse of him before he reached the exit. She thought of calling out, maybe to ask something more, maybe just to say goodbye, but the words never left her lips. Something in his pace, in the way his shoulders held the years, told her he wouldn't stop. And somehow, that felt right. Outside, the sky had cleared. The air still smelled of wet earth and cedar, and the sun pushed gently through the clouds, casting long, quiet shadows across the sidewalk. Walter walked slowly, one hand tucked in his coat pocket, the other resting loosely by his side. There was no car waiting for him. No ride arranged. Just the road stretching out ahead and a town that didn't know his name. He passed by the side of the chapel where the stained glass windows glowed with morning light. For a moment, he paused, not to admire, but as if listening to something old, something finished. Then he kept moving. Inside, Margaret stood near the doorway, watching him disappear down the walk. Karen joined her. "Is that him?" Margaret nodded. "He came alone. And he's leaving the same way." Karen folded her arms. "Do you think he's done this before? Other funerals?" Margaret thought about it. "I don't know. But I think he only does it when it matters." Karen looked at the folded flag still in Margaret's arms. "He mattered." Margaret nodded again. "So did Dad." They both stood quietly, not ready to go, but no longer needing to stay. A few minutes later, one of the young men from the service passed by them and said, "I don't know who that man was, but something about the way he stood, it made me sit up straighter." Margaret smiled softly. That's what real presence looks like. And in the stillness that followed, the meaning of the morning settled into something whole. It hadn't been about ceremony. It hadn't been about speeches or history books. It had been about a promise kept without an audience. A life honored not with fanfare, but with a quiet act of return. Walter didn't leave behind a name or a business card. He left behind something harder to define, but impossible to forget. A weight lifted. A silence filled. And as he walked farther down the road, into the soft hum of a new day, there was no doubt. He had done what he came to do. And that, too, was enough. Some stories don't need to be loud to be unforgettable. Walter Dean never asked for recognition. He didn't come to speak or be seen. He came to keep a promise. In returning that folded flag, quietly, faithfully, he reminded us that true honor often lives in the silence between words. Sam Price lived a life of service not just in uniform, but in everyday acts of quiet goodness. And like many veterans, he carried his past not as a burden, but as a shield to protect the people he loved from truths too heavy to explain. The lesson is simple, but powerful. Sometimes the deepest loyalty isn't spoken, it's lived. And the greatest good we do might never be known, except by the one we do it for. Have you ever known someone like that? Someone who carried more than they ever let on. If this story moved you, we invite you to like, share, and subscribe to Legacy of Courage Stories. Because these quiet heroes deserve to be remembered, and your support helps their voices echo a little farther.